Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my great pleasure to welcome a colleague, a friend, and a great scholar, Rabbi Aharon Adler from Yerushalayim. Rabbi Adler, his resume is very long, appropriately so because of all of the things he's accomplished in his life, including his PhD in Talmud from Bar Ilan, his Smicha from Yeshiva University, but he is also the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Bnei Akiva Ner Tamid, that is in Chashmonaim. He currently serves as its president, and he's the Rav today of the synagogue Oel Nechama in Katamon, Yerushalayim. And he is the author of a brand new book, which is called 70 Conversations in Transit, about his time of being with Rav Soloveitchik. And I thank you, Rabbi Adler, for joining me today. And I'm looking forward to learning a lot about those years when you were with the Rav.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good evening in Yerushalayim.
Yes. So let me just start simply. You started, I think, 1974, driving the Rav, and you in these conversations in the book you have 70 different conversations you had, talking. I think one of the best lines I saw there, it was right at the beginning where Dr. Lichtenstein said, where you described the fact that when you were driving with the Rav, you chose to drive in the right lane so you had extra time with him. And Dr. Lichtenstein said, "You think my father didn't know you were doing that? But Baruch Hashem, you did it." What was it like to be with the Rav in the car with those private times?
Okay, so I would tell you that what's most important when talking about the Rav's life is the two hats that he wore, one in Boston and one in New York. In Boston, he was a town Rav and he was accessible. In New York City, he was a very stoic Rosh Yeshiva. And most of us saw him in that capacity where we had this awe and reverence that you could not get close to the Rav. You went to his shiurim, you heard the lectures, and you read his material and all that. But he was not a folksy, schmoozy person at all. The unique, let's just say, opportunity that came by my way was because my older brother, Rabbi Yosef Adler from Teaneck, was actually the Rav Shamus, a position that began after 1967 when the Rebbitzin passed away and the Rav needed some assistance in New York City. And my brother had that position and he called me up in September and he asked me in 1974 if I'd like to drive the Rav. And I said yes. I hung up and I almost fainted because I realized what kind of this awesome type of responsibility. So it took a few weeks of driving the Rav for myself to calm down and realize that in spite of the fact that we're talking about one of the greatest the world of Torah and thought of the last millennium, he's a human being that's sitting in my 1964 Chevrolet and being driven. And a one-on-one situation, he was a booby. He really was, he was attentive and he would give me the time of the day to work out whatever I wanted to talk about, whether it was a halachic issue, whether it was something in current events. I usually prepared a little bit of a piece of paper, we call it in Hebrew a petek, that had about 10 items on it. And I say if I got 2 or 3 done on a particular Tuesday morning from LaGuardia to the yeshiva, that was a great day. So I really had to squeeze out those 5 minutes on the Triborough Bridge, and we did it effectively. So it was, at the beginning, it was nerve-wracking experience, but by the end of it all, he really became my third grandfather. And he really was that kind of a figure to me.
How long did you drive him?
So I was his driver for 3 years. And last year, I was also the shamus in the apartment when my brother got smicha and he left the yeshiva. So I did have this opportunity of seeing him in the apartment as well.
And one question which I had before, when I was just reading the introduction and understanding the role of the driver, is before the Rebbitzin passed away, who drove him? Why didn't he need a driver then?
The Rebbitzin came from Boston to New York with him on the train, and then they flew in the late 50s and 60s. They already flew. So the Rebbitzin came into New York with him, so he didn't need that assistance. When she passed away, the Rav needed help making a cup of coffee for himself.
No, but I mean, the shamus part I understand, but the driving part, did the Rav drive himself?
They were drivers. They were Bostonians who at YU who were the first drivers. And the Rav obviously was more comfortable with those who were local. But then he just had to get used to the New Yorkers. And he found out that we also knew how to drive.
And you also mentioned in your book that you had started writing it many years ago. You give thanks actually to two Chicagoans who are friends of yours who we know very well, Ruby and Rabbi Jay Karzan. What ultimately brought about bringing this book to press?
But the idea of putting together these conversations was germinating many, many years ago. I would say over 40 years ago. I used this material throughout my career as a teacher, as a rabbi, in spicing up many of the topics that I would talk about in a particular lecture or shiur. The title of the book, the Hebrew title, Vahi ben Soah Aharon, is almost over 40 years old. It was a play on my name, Aharon, Ha'aron, but also, as I mentioned in the preface, a thought that Rabbi Menachem Genack from the OU brings from the Rav himself, that the Aron Brit, the Ark in the Aron Kodesh, in the Kodesh Kodeshim, they had the poles, the Badim, and they were never removed. And that was a question, why were they never removed if the Aron was going nowhere except being in a stationary position in the Aron Kodesh, in the Kodesh Kodeshim. The Rav said the Aron symbolizes a Talmud Chacham, and the Kodesh Kodeshim, his Beit Midrash. The Badim, the poles, symbolize portability of Torah. And it was extremely important, the Rav said, that a Talmud Chacham does not stay in his Beit Midrash, but moves out and teaches and so on. So this Vahi ben Soah Ha'aron, the Torah that I'm bringing to people's attention, was in transit. It was in motion, so it's an Asiyah. I wanted that to be the title of the book finally, but my publishers here in Israel felt that if this book is in English, it had to have an English title. So they came up with the idea, 70 Conversations in Transit with HaGaon Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. Let me just correct you. I know the Carsons very well, and they're dear friends of mine as well. We're referring to the Lewis family.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Bill, sometimes known as Willie and
Yes.
Rena Lewis, who
Rena Lewis, I
very,
apologize.
very helpful
Yes.
to me personally in getting this book out. But
Yeah.
what ultimately happened was coronavirus. So people are going to write the history of the year of Corona, and they're going to write about all the terrible things that happened and all the limitations and so on. So I will add to that list by saying that many good things happened. And one of them was I had a lot of time to write a book. And the fact that I was in bidud, as we say, in isolation and quarantine and so on, for several weeks here and several weeks there, it allowed me the opportunity to focus on these stories, to put it together, and then the editing. I will single out Rabbi David Shapiro, who read the book from beginning to the end and offered so many constructive comments, both in terms of style and content, as well as the material itself. We had to verify the authenticity of the stories because I did not have a tape recorder and I didn't take notes, but I remembered these stories because I reviewed them over and over in speeches, and I have a fairly good idea that the stories were very, very accurate. But I did double check with the people involved what they remembered, so we can correlate the events. So we do have an authentic story coming out.
And my apologies to the Lewises, who also actually, we remember them very well from Chicago. And I had the opportunity to work with Willie Lewis when he was assistant principal at Hillel Torah.
Yeah.
Wonderful people. But is there, of the 70, is there one or two that have always been your favorite?
So one in particular has to do with a Shiva visit. It was not uncommon that on Wednesdays, let's just backtrack, the Rav came into New York on Tuesday morning. He gave a shiur for 3 hours. He gave a shiur Tuesday night to Balabatim for another 2 hours. He gave a shiur Wednesday morning for 3 hours and Thursday for 3 hours, and then flew back to Boston. So Wednesday was a full day where he could do something. If he had meetings or people wanted to see him, Wednesday was a very, very big day. And it was not uncommon that on Tuesday, off the plane from LaGuardia, he would tell me that we have to go to a Shiva this week, which meant Wednesday. And he gives me a name. And the name is Grunschpecht. Now, I have a cousin who's married to a Grunschpecht, and I knew exactly which Shiva he was talking about. And I didn't have a clue why in the world the Rav was going to go to this Shiva, where I myself had already paid a family Shiva visit to this cousin of mine. And the Rav tells me a story that the Grunschpecht who passed away, he was in the meat business many, many years ago. And one of his big customers was the cafeteria at Yeshiva University. And he serviced the Washington Heights general community. The community of the Breuers, Rabbi Breuer's community, were developing after World War II in Washington Heights, and they developed their own butchers and own hashgacha systems and so on. There was somebody there, certainly not from the top. I believe Rabbi Breuer was an absolutely perfect individual when it came to integrity and so on. But there was somebody down below in the business world and we know, unfortunately, business sometimes corrupts, that spread nasty rumors about this Mr. Grunschbeck, about his Yirat Shamayim, being God-fearing. And that's all you need to ruin a competitor. Just spread those rumors. What the Rav did, we heard about this, he issued a public proclamation of sorts that he knows this Mr. Grunschbeck to be Yirei Shamayim, and the Yeshiva University will continue to buy meat from him. And he tells everyone in the neighborhood they can feel comfortable purchasing meat from this particular business. And the Rav told me, I said, not only did I save the business of Yeshiva University for him, this contract, I saved his whole business. He said he would have gone under because of this. Okay, it's very nice. So I asked the Rav, I said, is the Rav in contact with the family? The Rav says, I haven't seen them for 30 years. So why do you feel that you have to go to the shiva? I mean, this was a long time ago. So the Rav tells me, I want the family to know that after 30 years, I never changed my mind about what I said about that person. Now that was a stroke of greatness, an absolute stroke of greatness, that the family should feel at the end that the Rav felt that the father who passed away was a Yirei Shamayim, and everybody who ate meat from him, it was perfectly okay. Subsequently, this cousin of mine told me that same year, she had a brother who was born, and there was a Brit, and they invited the Rav to the Brit. And the Rav said he'll only come if they serve meat at that Brit, and he's going to eat from it so that everyone should see that he trusts the Grunschbeck family business.
That's an example of the Rav being the Shtat Rav, but over into Washington Heights.
That's correct. So there were moments where he did function as a Shtat Rav, but not publicly. This is very private. I think I'm the first one to bring this story out, and I have permission from the family to go public with it and name them.
Now, you have a story there in terms of the way they referenced to the Rav as the Rav. The origins are interesting. I heard not long ago from Rav Schechter that he was telling the story that when he was in the Shir is when they appointed the president, and the president was going to be called the Rosh Yeshiva. And so as a result, almost in protest, the boys in the Rav Shir began to call the Rav, as opposed to the Rosh Yeshiva. But there was a different version that I read of yours.
Yeah, Rav Schechter himself has a piece in one of the books. I don't remember if it was the Pnei Arab or Nefesh Arab, where he brings the story that the Rav once commented how ironic it is that Rav Moshe Feinstein is known as the Rosh Yeshiva, even though his predominant fame in the Torah world was as a posek, as a Rav. And the Rav, he said about himself, he says, I'm a Rosh Yeshiva here, and they call me the Rav. Okay, but the truth of the matter is, the Rav was okay with the title. They referred to the Brisker Rav, his uncle in Brisk, Rav Yitzchak Zev, Rav Velvel Soloveitchik as the Rav. And I think it came from there, that the Talmidim in the yeshiva saw the Rav as the extension of the dynasty of Brisk. I think that's where it really came from, through Rav Velvel being referred to as the Brisker Rav. Although the Rav was never called the Brisker Rav, but he was called the Rav. But we used to have in the yeshiva about 20 guests who would come from other yeshivot. We used to call them in those days black hat yeshivot. While on the official registry of the class, we had 100 boys named on the attendance, and the Rav took attendance every morning, every time he gave a shir. Now I was the first one on the list, Aaron Adler, and I had another 15 minutes to go out and take a drink until the shir started. And then we had these other 20. So we had 120 fellows in the shir. One of these asked the Rav a question, and it was common in the yeshiva world to refer to a Rosh Yeshiva in the third person. The Rosh Yeshiva said, the Rosh Yeshiva asked, and so on. So this fellow pipes up and he says, the Rosh Yeshiva said, and the Rav looked at him and he says, I'm not the Rosh Yeshiva here. Dr. Belkin is the Rosh Yeshiva on the 5th floor. I'm a Malamed, a Posheta Malamed, simple Malamed, a Gutta, but a Posheta Malamed.
When you were in his shir, he was already delivering the shir in English.
Oh, absolutely. That went over in the 60s, before my time.
And so you started talking about how he gave the shir. He would start out taking attendance. I I know some people who were in the shir at the same time as his wife had passed away. And they said before she had passed away, being in the shir at times was a fierce experience. And that he seemed to have softened after that period of time.
Right. There's no question about that either. Talk to anybody for pre-1967 Rav Shir, you're going to hear words like the Rav was a terror. Rabbi Norman Lamb's in the film that was made about the Rav about 12, 13 years ago, he said that the Rav was a terror in the classroom. And my brother, Rabbi Yosef Adler, so he commented also that after the Rebbitzin passed away, the Rav mellowed, and he just wasn't the same person. And I'm just very happy that I saw him in the mellowed stage and not in the pre-stage. But what the Rav would do was begin the shir by asking somebody to read the Gemara. And he was really on the witness stand. He was grilled with some questions about the sugya, about the Tosfot, about whatever, maybe Ramban, whatever. And the Rav wanted to see if he knew something. And then the Rav would take over afterwards. My great fortune of being the Rav's driver is that the Rav was very kind to me and never called on me to read the Gemara. That was an unbelievable extra bonus, because I think he was worried that I'd drop him off in the middle of the Triborough Bridge, and he didn't want that. So I was never called upon, but I had the opportunities to talk to him anyway. Yeah.
And the shir went, it was 3 hours. I remember when the Rav's brother was teaching in Chicago, a 3-hour shir was an average, sometimes on the shorter side of shir.
Yeah.
And
they had the ability that the Rav was working many times on adrenaline, especially later in life. And he still had the koach, he had the power, the enthusiasm to give a shir. That was his life. When he finished the shir, it was like pulling the plug out of a robot toy that just stops moving. He was kaput, and he had to really rest afterwards. Especially after the Gimel Shvat, the Yortzeit shir, that was a 4-hour production, or the shir that he gave before Yom Kippur, the Tshuva Drasha, also a 4-hour production. He put in everything that he had, and it was very, very tiring and taxing on him, but he did it. Nobody ever noticed during the shir that he was failing in terms of strength.
And so 3 days a week, people would have shir with him. Tuesday,
Wednesday, Thursday.
Wednesday and Thursday, you'd have shir. Was he in the Beis Medrash after shir at all?
Rav never came to the Beis Medrash. He came in to give a shir, he went back to his apartment, and that was it. There was one incident that I mentioned in the book that was so highly unusual. It was the time in the middle of the shir where his stomach ulcers acted up, and he needed a cup of milk. And he turned around to me and he asked me if I can go to the cafeteria and get him a cup of milk. He gave me a quarter, a whole 25 cents. I ran down to the cafeteria, brought up his cup of milk. He sits down, he give it to him, he makes a bracha, he drinks, he turns around to me and he says, "How much was it?" Now, it actually cost 30 cents. And I said, "Rebbe, it's okay." "No, how much was it?" I said, "Rebbe, there's no change, don't worry." It's not that I'm keeping something. I don't want to tell him he owes me a nickel. So he kept arguing, kept saying, I said, "It's 30 cents. He says, "I owe you a nickel." Fine, we left it there. And that afternoon, the Rav uncharacteristically does come across the street back to the Beit Midrash area, and he's looking for me, and he's got a nickel in the hand. And I asked him, I said, "Why did you do that?" I was just, totally taken aback. He said, "Don't ever forget that there's a din of gezel on a pruta." And he really, really was careful. He was careful that all the ledgers, would add up and he wouldn't owe anybody money. Despite the fact that I was moichel, and I would have paid $10 just to have the honor to run and get him the cup of milk. That was of no consequence. He felt he owed me money. The Rav also came to the Beit Midrash on the days that he had Yortzeit for his mother and his father on the 20th of Tevet and on the 3rd of Shvat, respectively, where he learned Mishnayot in the Beit Midrash from morning to night, 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and he was fasting. He was fasting those days. And that was really an unbelievable sight to see, for him to give these marathon shiurim.
The Rav davened in the main Beis Medrash?
No, the Rav had what we call the Executive Minion. He had his apartment on the ground floor of one of the dormitories, known as the Morgenstern Dormitory, or popularly known as the Morgue, right? What a name for a dorm. And right next door to his apartment, there was an accessory room, and that's where the Executive Minion was, and that's where he basically davened. The only time I actually saw him daven was after the Yom Kippur War, when there was an issue of summertime that was extended through the winter, and all the early minyanim were really phased out because of the time factor. They had to go uptown from Brooklyn to Washington Heights to daven Shacharit, and I davened with the Rav's Minion. But there, I remember he did go downstairs to the Beit Knesset of the Morgenstern dorm, and it was the only time that I actually saw him davening.
So
Shachas. Mincha, I saw him all the time.
did the Rav give Mari Makomos before Shir?
The truth of the matter is, we did not get organized Mare Mekomot the way, let's say, Rav Lichtenstein, Olav Shalom did in the yeshiva in Gush. He just understood that you could figure out what the what's next on the agenda. Occasionally, he would say something in terms of we'll be dealing with something in a Ramban or something of this, so you knew you better take a look at it. But more often than not, you just have to be prepared with the basic sugya. He's not going to teach you the ABCs of the sugya. You have to come in knowing what's happening in the Gemara, and he'll pick up from there. And that's usually what happened.
So you had to prepare Gemara, Rashi, Tosfos, and I assume the Rambam.
Of course, the Rambam. Of course, without a doubt.
And
as the Rav once said, we all know that the Gemara came to explain the Ramban.
And so you prepared Gemara, Rashi, Tosfot, Rambam. The Rav would ask someone to start reading. Some of the stories I heard is he would take a person apart if he didn't. But those must have been from the earlier years.
Now, even in my years, it was a frightening experience to be grilled by the Rav at this opening number, to the extent that the fellas in the shir would try to gravitate, especially the new fellas, would gravitate to the back of this double room. And there were some pillars there, and people wanted to sit behind the pillars and out of the Rav's eye shot so that he doesn't see them. But there's a famous story that happened in my days. There was a fellow whose name was Shapiro, and not related to the Shapiros that we know. And he really sat in the back. And on Tuesday, the Rav goes through the attendance list, and he sees Shapiro. He says, all right, Shapiro, read the Gemara. Fine, Shapiro, gets all shook up, and he reads the Gemara. Come Wednesday, the next day, the Rav goes through the list. And the Rav says, all right, Shapiro, read the Gemara. Now, this can happen. There's a cluster effect in some random countings and so on. So Shapiro gets it 2 days in a row. On Thursday, on the third day, Shapiro is just dying to see what's going to happen. And the Rav goes through the list, and he looks up and he goes, all right, Shapiro, read the Gemara. And Shapiro looks up and he goes, Rebbe, Shapiro didn't come today. So the Rav looks at him and he says, all right, you read. This actually happened.
And were fellows jockeying for, besides hiding behind pillars, were they jockeying to be in the front rows? Was it just? Okay, so there was a tradition that at the beginning of the year, those who were we call the Vatikim, the old fellows, those that are there for 10 years and so on, they occupied, they had the first row, and they had their seats, their mokum kavua, if you may. And after beyond the first inner circle or half circle, then the seats were pretty open, and people would come on the first day of Shir and put their belongings on this place to reserve it. But once you had a seat, that really was your place for the year, and nobody took it. So was there also that as the years go on, you got to move closer up?
Oh yeah, that's part of Vetek, that's part of the experience in the Shir. So you can start out in the very back of the room, and if you're in the shir for 3, 4, 5 years, you will have moved up. That is correct.
And then on the other days of the week, the fellows who were in the shir, they were preparing the shir, or you were learning other things?
So on Mondays, there was always one top student of the Rav Shir who gave a Chazorah shir. When the Rav was not there, he reviewed the 3 shirim of the previous Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. In my days, it was Rav Aharon Kahn. One of the Chayzrim, as we call them, was Rav Heshi Reichman. I remember when he did it. And before that, it was Rav Hershel Shechter. Before Rav Hershel Shechter became a Rebbe in the yeshiva, he was the one who gave the shir.
The Chazor. And Sundays was?
Sundays, no, that's for dates.
Did you ever go to Boston in the summers with the Rav?
The truth is, I didn't have that opportunity to study with the Rav during the entire summer. What I did was, on several occasions, went up to Boston for the Yarchei Kala of the RCA rabbis, which he gave for 3 days, marathon shiurim, and really for hours and hours, he would give shiurim in the Beit Midrash of the Maimonides School in Brookline in Boston. So that I did have opportunity. I write in the 70th conversation, which really is beyond the scope of the driving, but I wanted to include it, was 1985, the last time I saw the Rav. And it was actually the last Yarchei Kala that he gave. The Rav's mental capacities were already failing at the time, along with his physical. He was wheeled in a wheelchair. And he said what he said, and people were asked not to interrupt him. At the end, people lined up to shake his hands, and to a large extent, people realized that this was a parting with the Rav. And at that point, I lived in Beersheba in the 1980s, and I looked at the Rav, and the Rav looked at me, and he says, "Send regards to all my friends in Beersheba." And I started crying because I didn't realize that he even remembered who I was because of what was going on in his mind, and that he knew that I was in Beersheba. And I was very, very thankful for that, and so on. It was a very emotional party, actually.
And the yeshiva that you founded in Chashmonaim is named for the Rav.
Yeah, so here, the town of Chashmonaim in the Modi'in area between Tel Aviv and Yerushalayim, back in 1995, contemplated beginning a yeshiva high school with boys from the Chashmonaim town and some other towns in the area. Dolev, which is not far away. They didn't even have the city of Modi'in yet up and running. So we began it with a class of 21 students in the 7th grade. I felt this was an opportunity a year and a half after the Rav passed away to perhaps have a yeshiva B'nai Akiva named after the Rav, as many of the other yeshivot B'nai Akiva carry the names of Netiv Meir, Rav Meir Bar Ilan, and so on. But I brought it to the families of the Lichtensteins and the Twerskis for them to work this out, first to see if they were in favor of it. And they actually liked the idea. Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, who today is one of the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshivat Har Etzion, he came up with the name Ner Tamid. You know that it's in memory of somebody when you say Ner Tamid. Tamid is an acronym of Taf Mem Yud Dalet, Torat Morenu Yosef Dov, and people understand that the Rav is being memorialized. And I tried my best when I was still functioning as the active Rosh Yeshiva for so many years, that a day wouldn't go by where they wouldn't hear something from the Rav. But I would add something, give a little bit of a Chicago note. In one of my first visits to Skokie, I actually went to visit the yeshiva, the Hebrew Theological College, and the Brisk Yeshiva. And at Brisk, I was there in the morning, and I saw that Rabbi Adlers, Zichrono Livracha, immediately after Shacharit, with everybody still wearing talis and tefillin, he got up and gave a 10-minute Dvar Halacha. It was essentially a full-blown shir in a very compact way. And I looked at him and I said, halavai that I should have a schut of doing something like that. I was so impressed that the Talmidim sat and they got so much out of a 10-minute brief shir, but it was a full-blown shir packed together in 10 minutes. And we started the yeshiva. I did exactly that. And I told them in Chashmonaim, this is something that I learned from Rav Aharon Soloveitchik Zatzal. Yeah.
And everyone has theories about why the Rav never went back to Israel.
Wow, that you're going to need more than half an hour. I touch upon it in the book.
I know.
There was opportunity in 1935 when he was candidate for chief rabbi of Tel Aviv.
Right.
There was this golden opportunity in 1959 when Ben Gurion offers him to become chief rabbi of Israel after the passing of Rav Herzog. And he contemplates it for over a half a year, which means he was deliberating. There was a side to say that he wanted to do it, but ultimately he doesn't do it. There are about 1,000 reasons out there why the Rav didn't do it. And if you ask each one of them, they'll swear to you that the Rav told them this. And you know what? I think they're all correct, because the Rav said many things to different people in different times, in different ways, and so on. So I talked to the Rav about it as well. I said, I heard that the Rav's uncle, Rav Elvela, was against it. The Rav's uncle was still alive at the time. And the Rav said, that's true, the uncle was against it. But that wasn't the critical note. It was the fact that he realized that it is a political position and he would not be able to say what he wants to say, when he wants to say it, and how he could say it. And he felt his hands would be tied. The Rav believed that a Rav has to be independent and say what he says with obviously using enough common sense to know how to say it, but not to be bound by the rules and regulations of state. And then almost as an afterthought, he tells me that, you know, that in the government offices, there's a photo gallery of all the predecessors of all the positions. You have it in the president's house, you have it in the prime minister's office, you have it in all the ministers, and you also have it in the office of the chief rabbi. The Rav says, I don't have a problem being on the wall with Rav Kook and Rav Herzog. I might have a problem being on the wall with those who come afterwards. And I don't want to get into names now, but The man was a prophet. He was a real Navi.
With that story and on that note, our time is up, Rabbi. I am looking forward to when you'll be able to join us in Chicago. I know you're going to be honored with a wonderful opportunity to study in the United States this coming year, and I hope to be able to see you in person. I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very, very much.
And
Kol Tov, and everybody should be well.
Amen.
And
continue writing and continue to teach us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Kol Tov.